"They were just sleeping," he said. "I never harmed them." In 2011, Russian authorities entered the apartment of Anatoly Moskvin, a respected linguist and historian. What they found defied comprehension. 26 mummified bodies of young girls, dressed in elaborate clothing, posed like dolls, and surrounded by toys and music boxes. Each had been exhumed from local cemeteries. Each had a name, a family, and a story. This is the story of obsession, desecration, and a system that failed to protect the dignity of the dead. It's about how one man's warped sense of preservation collided with cultural science, and how families were forced to grieve twice, one for the loss and again for the violation. Today, we explore the case of Anatoly Moskvin, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to ask how this could happen and what it reveals about justice, mental health, and the stories we choose to tell. Nizhny Novgorod is one of Russia's oldest cities, perched at the confluence of the Volga and Oka rivers. Rich in history and folklore, it's a place where the past lingers, in architecture, in ritual, and, as the case reveals, in the soil itself. Moskvin was no outsider. He was a scholar of Celtic burial rites, fluent in multiple languages, and a contributor to local historical journals. He walked cemeteries daily, cataloguing graves and writing about forgotten histories. To many, he was eccentric, but harmless, a man obsessed with death, but in a scholarly way. But beneath that veneer was a compulsion that went unnoticed for years. In a society where mental health is stigmatized and cemetery desecration rarely prosecuted, Moskvin's actions were enabled by silence. The graves he targeted belonged to girls aged 3 to 12 years, many from marginalized families. Their resting places were poorly maintained, their disappearance from the earth unnoticed. This is the landscape in which Moskvin operated, a city steeped in memory, but slow to confront its ghosts. Anatoly Yuryevich Moskvin was born on September 1st, 1966, in Gorky, Soviet Russia, now known as Nizhny Novgorod. He was an only child, raised in a modest apartment by his parents, with whom he would continue living well into adulthood. There's no record of abuse or neglect in his upbringing, but his home life appears to have been quiet, insular, and intellectually focused. His parents were reportedly supportive of his academic interests, and he was encouraged to read extensively. This early exposure to books and solitary study laid the foundation for his later obsession with knowledge, particularly obscure and morbid subjects. From a young age, Moskvin displayed signs of exceptional intelligence. He was a voracious reader, reportedly devouring encyclopedias and historical texts as a child. By adolescence, he had already developed a fascination with languages, folklore, and ancient cultures. He would go on to master 13 languages and specialize in Celtic studies, a field steeped in mythology, burial rites, and spiritual limbo. But even in childhood, his interests skewed towards the macabre. He began wandering cemeteries with his friends as a schoolboy. While most children might find graveyards unsettling, Moskvin found them captivating, places of mystery, history, and spiritual resonance. This wasn't a passing phase. His cemetery visits became habitual, and he began cataloguing graves, noting inscriptions, and imagining the lives of those buried beneath the soil. It was, in many ways, the beginning of his lifelong relationship with the dead. Despite his intellectual gifts, Moskvin struggled socially. He was described by peers and later by colleagues as eccentric, reclusive, and emotionally distant. He never formed close relationships, never dated, and preferred solitary pursuits. His classmates reportedly found him odd but harmless, a boy more comfortable with books than people. This isolation deepened over time. He abstained from alcohol and smoking, and avoided social gatherings. Even as an adult, he chose to live with his parents rather than seek independence. His world was internal, built around language, ritual, and the imagined lives of the dead. By the time he entered university, Moskvin's interest had narrowed. He studied philology at Moscow State University, focusing on Celtic history and folklore. These studies often explored themes of death, burial, and spiritual transformation, subjects that aligned perfectly with his pre-existing obsessions. He began collecting books obsessively, amassing a personal library of over 60,000 volumes. Many were esoteric topics: occultism, burial customs, necromancy, and historical accounts of death rituals. He also began building a doll collection, which would later take on a far more sinister role. His academic work was respected. He published articles, contributed to encyclopedias, and taught at Nizhny Novgorod's linguistic university. Moskvin was widely regarded as brilliant. He authored over 200 articles on linguistics, Celtic folklore, and history. As stated earlier, his personal library reportedly contained more than 60,000 books and documents. He was known for his encyclopedic memory and his deep knowledge of local cemeteries, which he visited obsessively. In 1979, when Anatoly Moskvin was 13 years old, he experienced what he later described as a formative and deeply disturbing event. According to Moskvin's own account, published in Necrologies, a Russian journal focused on cemeteries and burial culture, he was walking home from school in his hometown in Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod, when he was approached by a group of men dressed in black suits. These men, he claimed, were part of a funeral procession for an 11-year-old named Natasha Petrova, who had reportedly died from accidental electrocution. Without explanation, they pulled him into the procession and led him to the girl's coffin. Inside the funeral home, Moskvin said he was forced to approach the open casket. One of the men allegedly pushed his face down towards the girl's waxy forehead and compelled him to kiss her. He later said, quote, "I kissed her once, then again, then again." The girl's grieving mother then placed a wedding ring on his finger and another on her daughter, symbolically marrying the two. Moskvin referred to this moment as his strange marriage to Natasha Petrova, a ritual he believed had spiritual significance. He claimed that this experience awakened in him a belief in magic and a fascination with the dead that would shape the rest of his life. In the weeks following the funeral, Moskvin said he began experiencing vivid nightmares. In these dreams, the spirit of Natasha Petrova allegedly visited him, urging him to learn the dark arts so he could bring her back to life. He interpreted these dreams as a calling, an invitation to explore resurrection, ritual, and the occult. This incident, whether literal or symbolic, became a cornerstone of Moskvin's personal mythology. He referenced it repeatedly in his writings and interviews, framing it as the moment that ignited his obsession with cemeteries, burial rites, and the preservation of the dead. It's important to note that this story comes entirely from Moskvin himself. There are no independent records confirming the existence of Natasha Petrova, the funeral, or the ritual described. However, the consistency of his account and its focal point to his later actions makes it a critical piece of his psychological profile. Whether the event happened exactly as described or was a constructed narrative, it reflects the depth of Moskvin's delusional belief system. It also illustrates how early exposure to death, especially in a ritualized or traumatic context, can shape lifelong compulsions. Between 2005 and 2007, Anatoly Moskvin claimed he had visited 752 cemeteries across the Nizhny Novgorod region. This wasn't a casual hobby. It was a systematic, near-daily undertaking. He documented each site with meticulous detail, often walking miles to reach remote or neglected burial grounds. His goal, he said, was to preserve the memory of the forgotten dead. He recorded grave inspections and epitaphs, photographs of headstones and burial plots, notes on cemetery conditions, historical significance, and the burial customs, personal observations about the lives of the deceased, reconstructed from gravestone data. This work was part of a commissioned project by fellow academic Oleg Ryabov, who asked Moskvin to help catalogue the region's cemeteries for historical preservation. At the time, Moskvin's work was considered priceless by colleagues, like necrology's editor Alexei Yesvin. Moskvin coined the term necropoliist to describe his role, an expert not just in cemeteries, but in the cultural and spiritual dimensions of death. He saw himself as a guardian of memory, a chronicler of the forgotten. In his own words, quote, "I don't think anyone in the city knows them better than I do." He wasn't wrong. His knowledge of burial sites was encyclopedic. He could recall names, dates, and locations from memory. He knew which graves were tended and which were abandoned, who had been buried alone and which had no surviving relatives. This identity gave him legitimacy. It allowed him to roam cemeteries without suspicion, to interact with caretakers and families, and to access burial records. It also masked the deepening of his obsession. During this time, Moskvin published regularly in Necrologies, a niche journal dedicated to cemeteries and obituaries. His articles blended historical research with personal reflection, often romanticizing death and burial. He wrote about forgotten graveyards swallowed by urban sprawl, the spiritual significance of burial rites, the lives of young girls whose graves he visited. His tone was reverent, almost devotional. He described sleeping on graves to, quote, "feel the presence" of the dead, and claimed that certain spirits, quote, "called out to him." These writings, while unsettling in hindsight, were not viewed as dangerous at the time. They were seen as eccentric, poetic, and deeply committed to historical preservation. What began as documentation slowly morphed into something darker. Moskvin's cemetery visits became more frequent and more obsessive. He began leaving notes at grave sites, sometimes addressed to the deceased. He returned to certain graves repeatedly, forming what he described as relationships with the spirits of the young girls. By 2010, police began investigating a series of grave desecrations across the region. Headstones were overturned, burial sites were disturbed, and strayed symbols were left behind. Moskvin's name did surface, but not as a suspect, but as a potential expert. He was known as the city's cemetery authority. No one suspected that he had already exhumed dozens of bodies and brought them home. In Moskvin's adult life, he lived with his elderly parents in a cramped flat on Pervomaskaya Street. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. The apartment was cluttered with books, papers, and what appeared to be large, elaborately dressed dolls. Some wore knee-high boots. Others had makeup carefully applied to their faces. Many were seated on furniture, while others were propped against walls or stored in closets. One had a music box embedded in her chest. Another contained grave soil and personal items from her burial site. Neighbours had long complained about a foul odour emanating from the apartment, but no one suspected the truth. Moskvin's parents believed the figures were homemade dolls, part of their son's eccentric hobby. His mother later said, quote, "We saw these dolls, but did not suspect there were dead bodies inside. We thought it was his hobby to make such big dolls and did not see anything wrong with it." Between 2003 and 2011, Moskvin systematically visited cemeteries across Nizhny, Novgorod, and surrounding regions. He claimed to have visited over 750 burial sites during this period. His targets were specific: the graves of young girls, often from marginalized or overlooked families. He kept detailed notes on each site, including burial dates, family names, and the condition of the grave. Moskvin operated at night, often disguised in dark clothing. He carried tools for exhumation and used maps to locate graves he had previously marked. Once he unearthed a body, he would transport it home in a backpack or a trolley. In some cases, he returned to the same grave multiple times, leaving notes or symbols behind. He later claimed that he was rescuing the girls from neglect. Quote, "I felt sorry for these children who could have been reborn. I brought flowers to their graves, and sometimes I slept on them to determine if the spirit wanted to come back." Moskvin's preservation methods were crude but effective. He used a combination of salt, baking soda, and industrial-grade desiccants to dry out the bodies. He then wrapped them in layers of cloth, plastic, and sometimes nylon tights to maintain their shape. To mask decomposition, He applied makeup and nail polish, and stuffed the bodies with rags or padding. Some corpses were fitted with masks made of wax or paper mache. Others had hollowed-out torsos filled with personal items from their graves, photographs, jewelry, or even school notebooks. In several cases, he inserted music boxes into the chest cavities so that the bodies would play tunes when touched. Moskvin referred to these preserved bodies as his daughters. He celebrated birthdays with them, watched television alongside them, and spoke to them as if they were alive. He claimed he had no sexual interest in the corpses, insisting that his motivations were spiritual and emotional. So how did the police catch on to Moskvin? In late October 2011, Russian police were conducting a routine investigation into a series of vandalized graves in the Nizhny Novgorod region. Several local cemeteries have reported disturbances, headstones overturned, burial sites tampered with, and strange notes left behind. The authorities suspected that someone with intimate knowledge of cemetery layouts was involved. Moskvin, already known as a self-proclaimed necrologist and self-proclaimed cemetery expert, had previously contributed to articles to Necrologies, a publication focused on burial rites and grave histories. His name surfaced during the investigation as someone who might have insight into the vandalism, or possibly be involved. When police arrived at his apartment to question him, they were not prepared for what they had found. Upon entering the flat shared by Moskvin and his parents, investigators were met with an overpowering stench. The space was cluttered with books, papers, and what appeared to be large, elaborately dressed dolls. But something was off. The proportions were too lifelike. The eyes were glassy, the skin waxy. One figure had a music box embedded in its chest. Another was seated at a small table, surrounded by toys. It didn't take long for police to realize that these were not dolls, that they were mummified human remains. In total, 29 bodies of girls and young women were discovered, aged between 3 and 29. Each had been exhumed from local cemeteries, preserved using homemade techniques, and posed throughout the apartment. Some were stored in closets, others seated on shelves or beds. Many wore makeup, wigs, and clothing. Police found extensive documentation in Moskvin's apartment, such as grave maps and burial records, journals detailing each girl's name, age, and burial site, letters written to the deceased, often in childlike handwriting, and books on mummification, occult rituals, and Celtic burial rites. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Moskvin confessed immediately. He explained that he had been rescuing the girls from neglect and loneliness. He believed their spirits were calling out to him, and that he was preserving them until science could bring them back to life. He said, quote, "I never killed anyone. I was waiting for science to find ways to bring them back." Following his arrest, Moskvin underwent a psychiatric evaluation. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and declared mentally unfit to stand trial. In May 2012, the Levinsky District Court ordered that he be committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. This decision sparked public debate. Some believed Moskvin should face criminal charges for desecration and abuse of corpses. Others argued that his delusional belief system and lack of intent to harm made psychiatric confinement the appropriate response. Russian law allows for indefinite psychiatric detention in cases where the individual is deemed a danger to society. Moskvin's confinement was reviewed periodically, but each time, the court upheld the decision to keep him institutionalized. Moskvin was sent to a secure psychiatric clinic in the Nizhny Novgorod region. There, he received treatment for schizophrenia and was monitored by forensic psychiatrists. Over the years, he reportedly responded well to medication and therapy. In 2021, his lawyers petitioned for his release, arguing that he was stable enough to become an outpatient. Moskvin expressed a desire to move to Moscow, marry his girlfriend, a language student he had met during confinement, and resume work as a language teacher. He also planned to write a book about his life and beliefs. However, the court denied his request. Judges ruled that Moskvin remained a danger to society and that his delusions, while less acute, had not fully resolved. The decision was based on psychiatric assessments and public safety concerns. For the families of the girls whose graves were desecrated, the arrest brought a second wave of trauma. Many had buried their daughters years earlier, believing that they were at peace. To learn that their remains had been stolen, mummified, and displayed in a stranger's home was devastating. Olga Shadamova, whose daughter was among the victims, became a vocal advocate for justice. She called for Moskvin to be tried in court, arguing that psychiatric confinement was insufficient. Quote, "He should be punished. He knew what he was doing. He desecrated our children's graves and treated them like toys." Some families attempted to rebury their daughters, but the bodies had been so altered that identification was difficult. Others chose to leave the graves untouched, fearing further trauma. Anatoly Moskvin never stood trial. He was never sentenced in a conventional courtroom, never faced the families whose daughter he exhumed, preserved, and posed like dolls. More than a decade later, in 2025, he remains confined under strict supervision. Despite occasional petitions for release, most notably in 2021, when he expressed a desire to marry and resume teaching, the courts have consistently denied his requests. Psychiatric evaluations continue to deem him a danger to society, and the families of the victims remain adamantly opposed to his release. Moskvin has reportedly expressed interest in writing a book about his life, and in interviews, he maintains that his actions were not sexual or violent, but spiritual. He insists he was trying to, quote, "bring the girls back, through science or through magic." Whether this belief has softened or evolved remains unclear. What is certain is that the trauma he inflicted continues to reverberate, not just through the families, but through the cultural silence that allowed his crimes to go unnoticed for so long. Moskvin once said, "You abandoned your daughters in the cold. I brought them home and warmed them." It's a chilling statement, one that reveals the depth of his delusion and the profound violation at the heart of this case. This isn't a tale of violence in the traditional sense. It's a story of stolen rest, of graves disturbed and grief unearthed. The girls Anatoly Moskvin unearthed were not just casualties of one man's delusions. All were laid to rest with the hope that they would remain undisturbed, that their memory would be held in peace. But that peace was broken. Their graves, meant to be places of remembrance, became sites of violation. Their bodies were taken, altered, and displayed in a stranger's home. What should have been silence and stillness became something grotesque, something they never consented to. Thank you for listening.